So let's say we wanted to fix this issue where it's kind of flying out into space. Now we already have something that tells us where, let's say, the outline should be, and that's the alpha. Now the alpha is the final kind of flattened version of this volume. But let's say even while the volume is still in volumetric form, the scatter is scattering through density. So really, as a kind of a quick and dirty, I mean, this whole scatter job in the first place is quick and dirty. Let's use the density to say where it is allowed to be. So I'm going to say snapshot that, stop it. Let's go back into our shader. And you can see working on the shader really isn't that scary, is it? It's all pretty like, where is it? How much is it? What color is it? It's not that bad really. So let's take the density, which is what I was just starting to say. The density. Now the density could be, 0 to 25 or 100 or whatever. I'm mostly just interested in the 0 to 1 aspect of it. So I'm going to take a clamp. And this clamp will take the density. And, to be sure of what I'm looking at, if you ever lose track of where you're supposed to be, just follow one of these things. See, there's the density. There's the input. Just follow it back, and there you go. This was apparently the density that was calculated because of whatever all this stuff did, which really also isn't that calculated or complicated. It's really just reading the density and doing some things. The point is, this is the result. That's what we want. Take clamp, which by default goes from 0 to 1. And this is going to be essentially a mask for us, where I'm going to say, you can't ever be that bright if there isn't that much density to reflect you in the first place. And once we get to a value of 1, then, you don't want you to become any brighter than you already are. I don't want you to become brighter and brighter just because you're in a denser and denser area. But the main idea is where there is no density, when it's less than 0, we definitely don't want any scatter, just living out in space. And that's pretty much it. I just need to take this clamp and then multiply it into the actual place that it exists, which is this first one. So make a multiplier. I don't like it when it starts by making it in the line. I want to put it there myself. So multiply our scatter amount by the clamp. And that is literally it. Again, not physically accurate. I mean, maybe even technically the scatter should be brighter if it's less dense. But honestly, it works pretty well. And there you go. This looks really cool now. I hope you agree. I mean, this was crazy, but now we just have a bright, living volume as opposed to this. This is just orange and darkness, which was something, but to have it actually be alive with light like this really feels like an explosion. That's a lot of the effect, and is also where we're going to get some of this brightness in the crevices here. So let's save it. Let's take a look at it. Let's do a full render of it and see what we have so far. Been a while since we've done one of those. So here's both of our frame 31s. This is the new one here on the right. You can see there's way more life in it than that one. I mean, obviously. Press play, you can feel it. It's very bright in the beginning, which is an issue that this one didn't have quite as much, although it did too. But that's something that we can work on now. But nonetheless, it still looks great overall. And honestly, it would be very bright at the beginning. I mean, of course, it's very, very bright. It's the moment of the explosion. Nonetheless, we usually try to tamp that down a little bit for the sake of, film and just seeing what's going on. So let's say we took a frame like this. If we were to reduce the brightness right here, there's a lot of detail here. It's just all being multiplied by huge numbers. So if I press I, you can see the colors are like 23, 6, and 2. It's just very, very, very bright, which again is why we're able to do something like that. Now, so with that in mind, we can try to tamp this down, at least somewhat, in the beginning, with a combination of compositing and also with the shader itself. We're not quite done with that just yet. Looking at the flame scatter, it seems that a lot of it is coming from the scatter. Let's take a look at the whole thing through though. I mean, it looks really cool. I mean, that's the, no, I didn't actually, oops, gave myself away. I didn't actually let the whole thing run. But anyway, the scatter itself looks really cool. I mean, that alone, it looks like we have like really dark sunglasses or something, or like a welding face mask over it so that we can see a really bright thing like this. But what I'm trying to point out is the flame main is still what has a lot of the original structure of the flame. Whereas it's the flame scatter that has, of course, more of the wash. So what we might want to do is let's help flame main have more structure in these earlier parts. And where a lot of this is coming from, it's the density. Density being high is what blocks off some of this stuff. So what would be cool is if we could have the density be artificially higher when it's in these like super bright areas like this. So let me show you what I mean. If I were to choose one of those frames, like let's say frame 16, let me render that real quick so you can see what I mean. But this should be a relatively early frame that's very bright and we don't see a lot of detail. There you go. Look at flame main. There is some detail there, but we can't really see it overall. So I'm going to save that image and I'm going to go into our material area here. I'll turn that off. Let's just, I guess I didn't need to turn it off. Let's make the density super high, just temporarily, just to see if this fix would even work. My idea is again, we're gonna look at the temperature and say, are you very, very, very hot here? Well then let's, for now, make the density also higher here. And you can see that there is a difference. We went from this to this. And furthermore, if you look at the actual flame itself, we go from this to this. So we can get a lot of the detail back just by making the density higher in those places. So this is just another one of many things that are not necessarily physically based, but are easy enough to implement. So let's just do it, not worry that it's not physically based. Maybe it is physically based for all I know. I would love if somebody told me that it was actually technically physically based. So what is it that we want to do? We want to change, we want to modify the density. Really, we're going to want to modify the density for all three of these things that are asking for the density, but let's just do it in one place here first. So my theory was, if we take a parameter, we can say, call it something like temp to density, something like that. Temp to density range. I'm going to make this 2 floats. So it's because it's going to be a range. It's going to be a minimum and a maximum. And I'll just say 0 to 1 by default or something. And we can take that vector 2 and just turn it into the 2 floats. So just as a convenience, we can have a range, just left and right, like so. And then we'll fit a temperature. So that's what we're actually basing this off of. Let's fit the temperature. That lives all the way down here. So temperature. So I'm taking it before it's modified and everything. I just want the temperature from the actual temperature field itself and say from the minimum value that we asked for to the maximum value that we asked for. I want to come up with some numbers to multiply by our density. So when the temperature is below the minimum value, I want this to be 1. Because 1 times, we're going to multiply this by the density, 1 times something is its original self. And then the maximum, what it remaps to, will be some other parameter. So I'll say this parameter will be called temp to density scale. So that'll essentially be the maximum value. And then, like I said, we'll just multiply the density. So grab it from there, like so. I'll just move it up here. multiply it times this chicanery that we just came up with, and now this, in essence, is the new final density. So get the density for our main pyro shader, shift get the density for our volume shader core, and shift get the density that we were using here to tamp down the edges of the scatter. So take all three of those, and they'll now be referring to this instead. So as it stands, if I say temp to density scale is 1, I guess I should just make the default be 1 here. Nothing will happen because, of course, the end result, the output of this is either 1 or 1, 1 to 1. So we're not going to see anything different here, or at least we shouldn't, not compared to what it used to be here. But so now let's try to actually work with this. I want to multiply by 100, or maybe something less, but let's try 100. But I need to figure out like a temperature range to have this work over. So I'm going to say, let's just play with it. Let's do something like, so right now it's doing it here, but I don't want to do it everywhere. I want to make sure that it's not doing it, especially on later frames, because it's not the regular density that I'm trying to affect. So let me find a perhaps later frame. See, right now it's multiplying 100 times everything here. So if I go back to 1, you'll see this is the wispiness that we used to have. So I want to kind of find a range like 0.4 to 0.2 to 0.4. So anything less than 0.2 won't get that. So if I put the 100 back here, that should keep this not being affected, but it should be affecting stuff up here. So let me put it back to 1 here. Take a little snapshot. Now put it to 100. We might not see much of a difference. I feel like there's the slightest difference going on, but not really much. Let me save that. Let's go back to frame 16 itself, the one that we were working on earlier. Let's see. I should save that if I haven't already. I'm not sure if I'm getting any result from this yet, so let me go back to 1. It looks like I probably am. Just a little bit. It's really, though, it's the flame main that I'm interested in. So this is what I had. So that was actually a pretty big result, where we were recovering a lot more detail. And in comp, I can just dial back the actual scatter that's blowing it out on those frames. We could even continue to work on the shader itself to have the scatter dial itself back, but I don't want to necessarily spend too much more time on that. So I'm going to go to temp density range 0.1 to 0.2, where basically almost all temperature is going to now affect, because anything higher than 0.2 is going to get its density multiplied by 100. But look at that. So now the flame main is getting all of that. Still looks pretty blown out here, but like I said, we're going to scale down the actual flame scatter business. But for now, I'm confident that if we scale that down and we're left with this, we'll have quite a bit of detail in our actual resulting composite. So rather than re-render this whole thing again, I just want to go to a later frame, make sure that our wispy smoke is still looking wispy, because those wispy smoke areas really probably have almost no temperature anymore. So they should probably still be pretty wispy, and they are. So even though we're multiplying density by 100, these areas are not being affected by that. And in general, this, even besides the opening salvo there, even in general when we deal with these kind of hot frames, I was hoping it would render by now. There we go. You know, it should have some effect on these too. So we end up with these darker areas. They should stand out more on the flame. So we just have such a really nice and interesting look to this now. So the last thing, let's just do it in the next chapter.